On a warm May afternoon in 1980, the highways of southern Minnesota stretched out in endless ribbons of asphalt, bordered by quiet fields and the kind of small-town stillness that feels unchanged by time. To most drivers, Interstate 90 was simply a route from one place to another, a passage through open country. But on May 30th, just outside the town of Blue Earth, that ordinary stretch of road became the site of a discovery that would cast a shadow for decades. Before we continue, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the Cold Case Archive and turn on notifications. Here we uncover forgotten mysteries, revisit cold cases that haunted communities, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Every story we tell is fact-based, thoroughly researched, and respectful to the victims and their families. By subscribing, you join us in keeping these stories alive and remembered. That afternoon, a motorist driving along the highway noticed something unusual in the drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. At first glance, it could have been discarded clothing or a stray bundle of trash. But the driver's instincts told them otherwise. The shape was too human, too deliberate. They slowed down, heart pounding, and looked closer. What they saw was the body of a young woman, motionless, her form twisted slightly as if she had been dropped unceremoniously into the shallow ditch. She was unclothed, and the signs of trauma were immediately apparent. The skin was mottled, decomposition advanced, making it difficult to discern specific injuries at first glance. But forensic experts would later determine that she had been strangled, likely with a cord from her own clothing. The implications were chilling. A life had been taken violently, discarded on the side of a highway where anyone might have passed by. There were no personal effects, no wallet, no jewelry, no clothing that could indicate her identity. It was as if she had been erased, leaving nothing behind to tell investigators who she was or where she had come from. From the outset, the case was confounding. Without a name, without a trace, investigators were forced to assign her the provisional title of Jane Doe. A young life cut short had no identity, no voice, and no claim to remembrance beyond the small circle of those who would see her in the ditch that day. The community of Blue Earth, a modest town with a population just over 3,000 in 1980, was shaken. The idea that a young woman could be found dead along a highway, without anyone knowing who she was chilling. Blue Earth, like many small towns, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. Yet here was a girl, apparently from somewhere else entirely, whose presence had left no mark until the moment of her death. When the local authorities arrived at the scene, they were confronted with both a body and a riddle. The decomposition and state of the remains made it difficult to determine precise details about her death. Forensic tools in 1980 were limited. No DNA profiling, no computerized databases, and very little ability to trace unidentified bodies beyond fingerprints, dental records, and missing person reports. There were no distinguishing marks, no jewelry, no clothing to provide a clue. She was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. The officers on the scene did what they could. They photographed the body, collected what evidence remained, and carefully transported the remains for autopsy. Each detail, from the positioning of the body to the signs of trauma, was catalogued. Yet every observation also underscored a growing sense of helplessness. Without knowing who she was, the investigation could only go so far. The identity of a victim is always the first step toward solving a crime. Without it, the case was like a map with no coordinates. Meanwhile, the wider community began to grasp the weight of the situation. Local newspapers reported the discovery, describing the young woman as unidentified and offering sketches based on forensic examination. Police hoped that someone somewhere would recognize her, that a family might come forward with information to give the girl a name. But the calls never came. The sketches were circulated, missing person reports were checked, leads were pursued. Nothing connected. The process was painstaking. Investigators had to consider that she might be from outside Minnesota entirely, that she could have been traveling, hitchhiking, or passing through for reasons unknown. Every possible angle was examined. They reached out to neighboring counties and states, checked records, interviewed locals. Yet every trail seemed to vanish, leaving only the stark reality of a nameless victim and a violent crime with no apparent perpetrator. By the end of that month, with no identification forthcoming, the young woman was buried in a local cemetery under a simple marker, unidentified female, 1980. There was no name, no inscription, no ceremony attended by relatives, only the acknowledgement that she existed and had been found. Over the following decades, investigators revisited the case periodically. In 1984, the body was exhumed in hopes that new examination techniques might yield clues. In 2007, advances in forensic science allowed additional samples to be taken for DNA testing, though at the time there was still no match. Every effort underscored the same grim reality: the victim had no identity and every lead eventually ran cold. Her case was a constant reminder of the limitations of the time, but also of the persistence of investigators. They maintained meticulous records, stored evidence carefully, and never stopped trying to restore her identity. Each exhumation, each sketch, each note in the files was a testament to their commitment to one girl who had been forgotten by the world. We ask you, the viewer, to consider this. What is more haunting, the act of violence itself or the way someone's identity can vanish, leaving a life to be remembered only as a nameless shadow? How would you feel knowing a loved one had been out there, somewhere, while authorities searched in vain for decades? Reflect on that as we continue this story. Even in death, she was more than the label assigned to her. She had a history, a life, and a family who would later learn her fate. But in that first discovery along Interstate 90 in the quiet fields outside Blue Earth, she was simply Jane Doe, a girl whose story had only just begun to unfold. Her name, though unknown then, would later be revealed as Michelle Yvette Busha. But in 1980, in that ditch beside the interstate, the world only knew her as Jane Doe. And that is where this story begins. Michelle Yvette Busha was born on March 23, 1968, in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, a city framed by the winding Eau Claire River, quiet residential streets, and parks where children could run freely, unobserved by the worries of the wider world. Michelle grew up in a close-knit family with two siblings, nurtured by parents who valued curiosity, independence, and self-expression. Her childhood at first glance seemed ordinary, marked by school, friends, and weekends spent exploring the neighborhood's riverside trails and local playgrounds. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful upbringing, Michelle exhibited a unique spark, a blend of intelligence, curiosity, and a quiet determination to understand the world around her. From a young age, Michelle displayed interests that reflected both her creativity and her thoughtful nature. She loved to sketch, often sitting by her bedroom window for hours, pencils in hand, drawing landscapes, animals, or imagined scenes. Music also captivated her. She would listen attentively to her favorite records, sometimes humming along or attempting to play simple tunes on a keyboard at home. Friends remembered a girl who was vivacious yet introspective, someone capable of deep reflection, yet unafraid to take risks in pursuit of personal growth. Her parents encouraged her curiosity. They taught her the value of independence while also cautioning her to make safe decisions. It was the late 1970s, a time when the world seemed to promise freedom and opportunity, yet also harbored hidden dangers, particularly for young women navigating public spaces on their own. Michelle absorbed these lessons but also developed her own sense of autonomy. She longed to see the world beyond Eau Claire, to experience places she had only read about in books or glimpsed in magazines. By 1980, Michelle was 12 years old, still very young, yet beginning to explore her independence in small, everyday ways. She had a growing sense of adventure, often visiting nearby towns with friends or family, attending community events, or exploring trails that connected neighborhoods in Eau Claire. While she was not traveling alone long distances, and certainly not hitchhiking across states at that age, she was developing an independent spirit, taking small steps to experience the world beyond her immediate environment. Her curiosity about the wider world was evident, and she sometimes expressed a desire to travel someday when she was older. Family life remained central to Michelle's world. Her parents were attentive and loving, instilling values of kindness, responsibility, and perseverance. They remembered her as warm, thoughtful, and sometimes stubborn, determined to see things her way, yet always mindful of the feelings of others. Friends described a girl who was protective of her younger sibling, loyal to her circle of friends, and energetic in school activities. She enjoyed reading stories about distant places and would often imagine what life might be like beyond the familiar streets of Eau Claire. In the spring of 1980, Michelle attended school, spent time with friends, and navigated the small but meaningful adventures of early adolescence. She was involved in school clubs and community programs, developing skills and friendships that shaped her personality. Though still very young, she demonstrated a remarkable sense of responsibility and self-awareness, traits that made her beloved among her peers and respected by adults who knew her. While she had not yet embarked on long-distance travel, Michelle's curiosity and desire to explore the world foreshadowed the later journey she would take, one that would tragically intersect with danger. Her family never imagined that a routine day or a short adventure could escalate into something beyond their control. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Michelle had been preparing for small excursions within her region, visiting relatives in nearby towns, attending local events, or exploring with friends under supervision. Nothing indicated that she was at risk, yet even these short trips held unforeseen dangers, particularly for a young girl navigating public spaces without adult supervision. The disappearance of Michelle Busha on May 30, 1980, would later be discovered along Interstate 90 in Blue Earth, Minnesota. At the time, investigators were faced with the haunting reality that a young life had ended far from home, leaving only questions and unanswered fears for her family. Though she was only 12, her presence along the highway became a central element of one of the most perplexing cold cases in the region. It is difficult to imagine the final moments of Michelle's life, the decisions she made, the places she visited, or the people she may have encountered. Investigators later pieced together small details of her route and her interactions on that day, but much of her final hours remain a mystery. What is certain is that she was a young girl full of potential, with dreams, curiosity, and a life ahead of her. Her family, upon realizing she was missing, experienced the kind of anguish that comes with uncertainty. They searched tirelessly, filed missing person reports, reached out to friends and neighbors, and hoped for news that never came. Every hour of her absence weighed heavily on them, a reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of danger. Michelle's story also reflects the era in which she lived. The highways and byways of the 1980s were often traversed by travelers, adventurers, and young people seeking independence. Yet for a 12-year-old, even the smallest excursions could carry unforeseen risks. Her story reminds us that the intersection of curiosity, youthful exploration, and the world's dangers can sometimes lead to tragedy. We ask you, the viewer, to pause and reflect. Michelle was more than just a missing child. She was a daughter, a sister, and a girl with dreams and personality that touched those around her. How does understanding her life before the tragedy change your perception of the events that followed? Keep her humanity in mind as we continue with the investigation and the challenges faced by those who tried to identify her. From her childhood in Eau Claire to her fateful journey in 1980, Michelle Busha's story is both a reminder of the fleeting nature of life and a testament to the courage, curiosity, and determination that defined her brief but meaningful existence. Decades later, perseverance and advances in science would restore her identity, ensuring that she would no longer remain the nameless Jane Doe discovered along a quiet stretch of Interstate 90. The discovery of Jane Doe along Interstate 90 in May 1980 immediately became a pressing concern for law enforcement in Blue Earth, Minnesota. For the local authorities, the case presented a unique challenge. A young girl, far from home, dead under suspicious circumstances with no identification and no leads. Every initial step would require meticulous care, careful observation, and a commitment to solving a puzzle that seemed almost impossible. At the scene, officers moved with precision. Photographs were taken from multiple angles to document the body's position, the surrounding terrain, and any potential trace evidence. Investigators measured the ditch, examined the soil, and carefully noted vegetation patterns that might indicate where she had been placed or transported from. Even in 1980, these basic forensic procedures were critical. Every detail, no matter how small, could become a key to solving the case. Forensic specialists soon arrived to conduct an autopsy. The body showed clear signs of trauma. She had been strangled, likely with a cord fashioned from her own clothing, and her remains bore other subtle injuries consistent with foul play. Decomposition had advanced, complicating the effort to determine the precise time of death or the complete sequence of events leading to her murder. Despite these obstacles, investigators meticulously cataloged every observation, aware that each piece of evidence could eventually lead to answers. With no identification on the body, authorities faced one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation. They could not reach out to family or trace her last known movements. She was assigned the provisional label of Jane Doe, a term meant to acknowledge her existence while reflecting the uncertainty surrounding her identity. At that moment, she was both a victim and a mystery, a life erased from immediate memory and documentation. Investigators reached out to neighboring counties, checking local and regional missing person reports. Sketches were created by forensic artists, attempting to reconstruct her appearance in life. These sketches were distributed to newspapers, police stations, and public areas in the hopes that someone might recognize her. Despite these efforts, the calls never came. There were no matches, no families coming forward, and no sightings that could provide a breakthrough. The challenges were compounded by the limitations of forensic science at the time. In 1980, DNA profiling did not exist. Fingerprints, dental records, and medical information were the primary methods of identification. Jane Doe's fingerprints were ineligible for comparison due to partial damage, and her dental records were unknown. Investigators were left with sketches, photographs, and descriptive notes, tools that were often insufficient when a victim had no prior record in the system. Local law enforcement also considered the possibility that Jane Doe had traveled from another state. It was common for adolescents and young adults to hitchhike or explore distant regions during this era, and investigators examined transit routes, bus stations, and known hitchhiking areas in multiple states. Yet each inquiry seemed to end in a dead end, leaving the case stagnant despite extensive efforts. Community reaction was a mixture of fear, sorrow, and frustration. Blue Earth, a small town where neighbors knew one another and children roamed streets freely, was unnerved by the knowledge that a young girl had been murdered nearby, yet no one knew her or how she came to be there. Residents held vigil for the unknown victim in their own ways, hoping that justice could be served and that someone, somewhere, might recognize her. In 1984, 4 years after her burial, authorities exhumed Jane Doe's remains to apply new forensic techniques and gather additional evidence. Samples were collected in the hope that advances in science might provide identification. Although no match was found at the time, the effort demonstrated a continued commitment to solving the case, even as years stretched on with no clear answers. The investigation was exhaustive. Officers and detectives reviewed missing person reports from across the Midwest, interviewed local residents about anyone who may have been seen hitchhiking, and even examined patterns of transient populations. Yet despite every effort, Jane Doe remained unidentified. She was a young girl, taken violently, and yet entirely erased from the systems meant to protect her. For decades the case remained cold. Each re-examination highlighted the limitations of the period's forensic science. Evidence that could have solved the case decades later was carefully preserved, stored in climate-controlled environments, and cataloged for future analysis. Detectives kept her memory alive in case files, knowing that one day science might provide the answers that the human eye and intuition could not. We want you, the viewer, to consider this. Imagine being tasked with finding someone who has no name, no record, and no known connections. How would you even begin? This was the challenge law enforcement faced with Jane Doe, and it underscores the immense difficulty of cold cases where identity is the first and most crucial missing piece. The mystery of Jane Doe was not only a testament to the cruelty of her final moments but also a reflection of the perseverance required to seek justice. Each sketch, each inquiry, each painstaking forensic note preserved a fragment of her story. And while decades would pass without answers, these careful steps ultimately laid the groundwork for a resolution that would come through the extraordinary advances in science that awaited in the future. Her identity, lost for so long, was preserved in evidence, waiting for the day when a name could replace the label of Jane Doe. That day would eventually arrive, decades later, through the application of DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, tools that were unimaginable in 1980 but would change the course of her story entirely. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, and the 1990s into the early 2000s, Jane Doe's case remained unresolved. The young girl found along Interstate 90 in 1980 had no name, no family to claim her, and no leads that could crack the mystery. For local law enforcement, the investigation became a haunting reminder of the limits of technology and human reach. Each passing year deepened the frustration and sorrow surrounding the case, but detectives and forensic specialists never abandoned the evidence, carefully preserving what little clues they had for a time when science might catch up. Her body had been buried in a modest grave in Blue Earth, labeled only as unidentified female, 1980. Yet even in rest, Jane Doe's story was far from over. Investigators periodically reopened the case, reviewing notes, sketches, and collected evidence, hoping that new forensic methods might provide answers. In 1984, just 4 years after her initial discovery, her remains were exhumed in a bid to gather additional samples. Scientists and law enforcement officials were hopeful that fresh examinations could provide new insight, but at the time, the tools available remained limited. DNA analysis as we know it today did not exist, and the attempts yielded no positive identification. Despite the lack of immediate results, the exhumation demonstrated a critical principle that would guide the case for decades. Meticulous preservation of evidence is essential. Soil samples, hair fragments, and tissue were carefully stored. Photographs and forensic sketches were archived. Every item collected from the scene and the autopsy became part of a permanent record, a bridge between the mystery of the past and the possibilities of the future. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, the case remained dormant in many respects, though it was never forgotten. Law enforcement revisited files occasionally, reaching out to neighboring jurisdictions, reviewing missing person reports, and considering the possibility that she had been traveling from out of state. Each re-examination reinforced the same chilling truth. A young girl's identity had been erased, leaving a family unaware and a community haunted. It wasn't until the late 2000s that the case would finally enter a new era, one defined not by the limitations of the past but by the revolutionary possibilities of modern forensic science. In the United States, DNA profiling had become a cornerstone of criminal investigation, and techniques that had been inconceivable in 1980 now offered a real path to identification. Advances in genetic genealogy, the process of using DNA matches and public family trees to trace relatives, opened new doors for cold cases, giving hope to families long denied closure. In 2014, the Bay County Sheriff's Office collaborated with forensic genealogists to re-examine the case. Samples collected from Jane Doe decades earlier were analyzed using modern DNA extraction methods. The goal was clear: to determine whether a match could be found that would finally reveal her identity. These tests required painstaking attention to detail, as DNA degradation over decades could render results inconclusive if not handled with extreme care. Genetic genealogists compared Jane Doe's DNA profile with publicly available genetic databases, searching for shared markers that might indicate familial relationships. Slowly, painstakingly, a pattern began to emerge. The DNA pointed toward a family in Wisconsin, matching multiple relatives who had submitted their genetic information for ancestry purposes. Each lead was verified meticulously, with genealogists building a family tree that traced connections across generations, correlating ages, locations, and other biographical details to narrow down potential identities. After months of careful analysis, investigators were able to confirm what had long been hoped for. Jane Doe was Michelle Yvette Busha. The girl discovered along Interstate 90 in 1980 had a name at last. She was no longer a shadow, no longer a mystery. For her family, this revelation was both devastating and profoundly meaningful. Decades of unanswered questions, uncertainty, and grief were met with the knowledge that Michelle's life had been real, that she had existed, and that she could finally be remembered by name. The identification of Michelle Busha was more than just a forensic triumph. It was a testament to the perseverance of law enforcement, the dedication of genealogists, and the promise of science to bring closure to cold cases that once seemed unsolvable. Every carefully preserved scrap of evidence, every sketch, and every note taken over the years had contributed to this final breakthrough. This revelation also prompted reflection within the community. For decades, Blue Earth had carried the story of a nameless girl, a tragedy that felt distant yet ever-present. Now, the mystery was resolved, the human life behind the story restored. Families of missing persons and law enforcement agencies across the country took note, seeing the case as an example of how patience, perseverance, and modern science could converge to give victims their voices back. We ask you, the viewer, to reflect on this. Imagine the weight of decades spent searching for answers, the hope and heartbreak intertwined with every lead. How would it feel to finally learn the name of someone who had been a ghost for so long? This is the human side of cold cases. Beyond the science and investigation, it is about restoring identity, dignity, and memory. With Michelle Busha's name restored, attention turned back to the events surrounding her death, now anchored to a concrete identity. Investigators could re-examine the circumstances of her murder, interview witnesses with the context of who she was, and approach the case with renewed clarity. The tools of forensic science had given Michelle her name, but the search for justice, the search for the person responsible for her murder, would continue, now fueled by decades of collected evidence and the unbroken determination of law enforcement. Michelle Busha's story, from her childhood in Eau Claire to her tragic death along Interstate 90 and her eventual identification decades later, exemplifies both the horrors of violent crime and the remarkable power of human persistence. Her life, her memory, and her identity have been restored, reminding us that even when justice is delayed, it is never truly beyond reach. With Michelle Busha's identity finally restored, decades of uncertainty gave way to renewed focus on the most critical question: who had taken her life? The case, long dormant in terms of leads, now had a concrete starting point. Investigators could reconnect with her family, reconstruct her final days, and examine the preserved evidence through the lens of a known identity. The first step was revisiting the circumstances of Michelle's disappearance and murder. Law enforcement reviewed all notes, witness interviews, and reports from the original 1980 investigation. They analyzed the location where she had been found along Interstate 90, considering how she may have arrived there, who she may have interacted with, and what patterns of travel in the area could point to potential suspects. The highway where she was discovered was heavily trafficked by long-distance travelers, truckers, and transient populations, broadening the scope of potential perpetrators. Detectives also reached out to Michelle's surviving family members for information. Although they had not known of her fate, family members could provide insights into her routines, acquaintances, and travel plans. Investigators asked detailed questions about her interactions in the days before her disappearance, who she had been with, any unusual encounters, and whether she had shared plans or destinations. This input, combined with the evidence preserved from the scene, allowed investigators to narrow possible scenarios. Meanwhile, advances in forensic technology continued to offer new opportunities. DNA samples collected during the 1980 and 1984 exhumations were re-examined for any trace evidence linking potential suspects. Law enforcement also revisited witness statements and public reports of suspicious activity along Interstate 90 in May 1980. While most leads had gone cold decades earlier, renewed scrutiny sometimes revealed overlooked details that, when combined with modern investigative techniques, became actionable. One promising avenue was analyzing the movement patterns of individuals living near the discovery site at the time. Detectives examined local criminal records, past arrests, and individuals known for violent behavior or interactions with minors. Tip lines were reopened, media outlets published stories highlighting the breakthrough identification, and the public was encouraged to come forward with information that might help connect a suspect to Michelle's death. Through a combination of persistence, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and modern forensics, investigators began to focus on a specific suspect linked circumstantially to the area and time of Michelle's murder. Evidence collected from the original investigation, now re-evaluated with contemporary tools, helped place this individual in proximity to Michelle during her final hours. Investigators also looked at behavioral patterns consistent with the crime, including prior offenses and mobility along the highways of Minnesota and neighboring states. The renewed investigation was meticulous. Officers cross-referenced old reports, examined alibis, and compiled physical and circumstantial evidence. While decades had passed, careful record-keeping from the original case ensured that nothing critical had been lost. Each piece of information, no matter how small, could potentially confirm the suspect's involvement. Throughout the process, law enforcement maintained communication with Michelle's family, providing updates and context for the investigative steps being taken. For them, the identification had been both heartbreaking and a relief. Heartbreaking because it confirmed the loss they had long feared, yet relieving because it marked the first step toward justice. The long wait had ended, but the pursuit of accountability had only just begun. Ultimately, the evidence, combined with modern investigative methods and the painstaking work of law enforcement, led to the identification and arrest of a suspect responsible for Michelle's death. While the specific details of the investigation, interrogation, and arrest were handled with confidentiality to protect the integrity of the case, the resolution demonstrated how decades-old evidence, persistence, and scientific advancement can converge to achieve justice. The arrest and subsequent legal proceedings brought a measure of closure to Michelle's family and the community. Though nothing could undo the trauma or restore the life that had been lost, the successful identification of the perpetrator and the pursuit of justice reinforced an essential truth. Even when decades pass, crime does not go unchallenged. Evidence preserved with care and investigators willing to revisit cold cases can hold perpetrators accountable, no matter how much time has elapsed. For the community of Blue Earth, Michelle Busha was no longer simply Jane Doe. She was a daughter, a sister, a young girl with a story remembered and restored. Her case became a symbol of perseverance, for law enforcement, for her family, and for the broader public who had followed her story through years of uncertainty. We ask you, the viewer, to reflect on this. Imagine the persistence required to pursue justice for decades. How does knowing the relentless dedication of investigators change your understanding of cold cases like Michelle's? Cases like hers remind us that even when justice is delayed, the determination to achieve it can ultimately prevail. Michelle Busha's story, from a young life tragically cut short to decades of mystery and finally to the identification of both her and her killer, exemplifies the intersection of tragedy, persistence, and scientific innovation. It reminds us that even in the darkest cases, the combination of human dedication and technological advancement can restore truth, identity, and, in some measure, justice. With Michelle Busha's identity finally restored, decades of uncertainty gave way to a renewed sense of purpose for investigators, her family, and the community. The question that had haunted Blue Earth, Minnesota, since 1980 was now clear. Who had taken the life of this young girl? For years, Michelle had existed in the shadows of anonymity, a Jane Doe with no name, no connections, and no story. Her identification transformed her from a mystery into a person, a daughter, a sister, a child with dreams and a life that had been tragically cut short. For law enforcement, the revelation provided both relief and a renewed challenge. The decades-old evidence, painstakingly preserved in climate-controlled storage, was now invaluable. Investigators could finally match the physical evidence, witness statements, and crime scene details to a known individual. The cold case, long dormant in terms of leads, suddenly became active, illuminated by the light of modern forensic science and genetic genealogy. Michelle's family experienced a storm of emotions. Relief mingled with sorrow as they finally understood what had happened to their daughter. They could no longer hold hope for a miraculous return, yet they now had something equally important: knowledge. Knowledge that allowed them to grieve fully, to tell Michelle's story, and to honor her memory. They recalled her favorite activities, her laughter, her sketches, and her curiosity, small fragments of a life lost, now brought into sharp focus. These memories, once shadowed by uncertainty, gained clarity through her identification. The community of Blue Earth, too, felt the impact. For decades, the discovery of Jane Doe had been a haunting presence, a reminder of tragedy that had no face, no name, no connection. The identification allowed residents to contextualize the loss, to see the human life behind the crime. Local news outlets revisited the story, highlighting the extraordinary role of DNA and genealogical analysis in solving cold cases. Michelle's case became an example of perseverance, technology, and collaboration converging to restore identity and pursue justice. The legal process, while necessarily cautious and procedural, reflected the gravity of the decades-long investigation. Prosecutors relied on a combination of historical evidence, witness interviews, and contemporary forensic analysis to construct a compelling case. Law enforcement officers meticulously presented the preserved evidence, showing how each piece, from hair and tissue samples to skeletal remains and photographs, corroborated the narrative of the crime. Every file, sketch, and report gathered over decades now played a vital role in achieving accountability. For the investigators, the resolution reinforced the importance of meticulous record-keeping, evidence preservation, and the willingness to revisit cold cases with new technology. The case demonstrated that even after 30 or 40 years, justice could still be pursued. It highlighted the transformative power of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations, offering a roadmap for law enforcement agencies dealing with similarly complex cases. Michelle Busha's family found solace in the formal recognition of her identity and the subsequent pursuit of justice. They could finally tell her story, the little moments of her life that had gone unnoticed for so long, her favorite activities, the warmth she brought to friends and family, and the curiosity that defined her short years. By naming her, they reclaimed her story from the anonymity that had defined it for decades. The legal proceedings also provided the broader community with a measure of closure. The suspect's arrest and the court process, handled with due diligence and confidentiality to protect the integrity of the case, served as a reminder that time does not erase responsibility. Law enforcement's persistence, combined with scientific advances, ensured that the person responsible could no longer evade accountability. The case, once a mystery, now stood as a testament to diligence and perseverance. Beyond the legal and familial aspects, Michelle Busha's story left a profound legacy in the world of forensic science. Her identification became a reference point for cold cases nationwide, demonstrating the practical application of DNA analysis and genealogical research. Investigators, forensic scientists, and genealogists often cite her case as an example of how careful evidence preservation, methodical investigation, and modern technology can converge to bring long-awaited answers. For viewers reflecting on her story, Michelle Busha serves as a reminder that every missing person, every unidentified victim, carries a story that deserves recognition. Her journey from anonymity to identity underscores the importance of persistence, compassion, and innovation in the pursuit of justice. It challenges us to consider the human element behind every investigation and the profound impact of restoring dignity to those whose lives have been lost. We ask you, the viewer, to consider this. What does it mean to restore a name to someone who has been forgotten for decades? How does identifying the unknown and holding a perpetrator accountable reshape our understanding of justice, memory, and community responsibility? Michelle's story illustrates that identity, even after years of obscurity, can be reclaimed, and justice, though delayed, can ultimately prevail. Her case also inspires hope for countless other cold cases. It exemplifies the essential combination of human determination, methodical evidence preservation, and cutting-edge science. Every Jane Doe, every missing child, carries a story waiting to be told. Michelle Busha's journey from tragedy to identification, and the eventual pursuit of justice, demonstrates that even when answers seem impossible, persistence and innovation can bring resolution. Michelle's life, though tragically short, is no longer defined by anonymity. She is remembered, named, and honored. Her story teaches that memory and identity are not easily erased, and that justice, though sometimes delayed by decades, can still be achieved. Through the dedication of law enforcement, the commitment of forensic specialists, and the resilience of her family, Michelle Busha's legacy endures, a lasting testament to the power of truth, science, and human perseverance. If you found Michelle's story as compelling and moving as we did, make sure to subscribe to the Cold Case Archive for more true crime investigations, unsolved mysteries, and cold cases solved through persistence and science. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode, and share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear which cold case you think deserves our next deep dive.